Hello, everybody. I'm here with David Prescott, and normally I do things different where I ask questions of guests and we do more of an interview type format. But because David and I wrote Creative Destruction together, we're just going to have a casual discussion today about ESG, what it means, and really what the danger is. So, David, unfortunately, as I've observed in my own life, many people, very well-educated people, don't even know what ESG is, what it stands for, what does it stand for, and why does it matter so much?
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having me on, and just a quick shout out to you, everybody out there listening. And if you want an incredible partner in crime and an individual that can just make magic out of random ADHD thoughts, which I give plenty of, Michael Ashley is your guy. So, Michael, it's been absolutely a great experience working with you, and man, I appreciate you more than you'll ever know. Now, what does ESG stand for? Michael, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And there are three criteria that have been established by multiple organizations, worldwide organizations, to measure the effectiveness of a company. And the E again stands for environmental, the S stands for social, and G is governance. So if we take a deeper dive into the environmental criteria, these examine how a company performs as a steward of nature, including factors like energy use, waste, pollution, and natural resource conservation. On the social criteria, the S of ESG, this looks at how a company manages relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, and the communities where it operates. These can include diversity and inclusion, DEI, human rights, and just a company's labor practices. And the G in ESG stands for governance. And the governance criteria deals with a company's leadership, executive pay, audits, internal controls, shareholder rights, and how the board is made up in terms of diversity. So in writing this book, you and I both know that 98% of the population doesn't have a clue what ESG stand for or have even heard of it. And the 2% that have really haven't taken a deep dive into what these criteria look like.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When I ask people in my own family what ESG stands for, they can't tell it to me. I actually became aware of this subject a few years ago. Someone told me that this was the American form of the Chinese social credit system, but it's being applied to businesses. When I say that to you, does that strike a chord? Does that sound right?
It does, and with your knowledge of traveling to China and seeing the surveillance state that exists, um, seeing that applied in American business, I can give you a real world example. We completed a large, when I say we, the company that I own and I've owned for 27 years, we provide professional environmental consulting, remediation, and field services for oil and gas entities, former refineries, pipelines, different things like that. And one of the services that our company provides is environmental drilling. We had a very, very large project that we completed, very successful. Now we're a privately held, Michael, as you know, privately held firm, about 110 employees, and we work throughout New Mexico and in Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado is the areas that we primarily service. Now we completed a large project, and it was a groundwater remediation project, groundwater investigation, and upon completion, we were called by our client, who's a Fortune 500 firm, and they wanted to talk to us about our ESG and specifically Scope 3 emissions. And as this company called us, they asked us, again, remember, we're a privately held, private owned firm, and they started asking questions like, where have you guys looked at in R&D, have you looked at getting electric drilling rigs? And so again, we're not drilling oil and gas. We're just drilling down several hundred feet and installing groundwater monitor wells into the top aquifer. And they're asking us, can you or is there electrical drilling rigs? Well, there's not, Michael. We don't have those, and they're not in service right now. And if we could get them, they would probably be 4 to 5 times more expensive than the conventional rigs that we use that have diesel engines on the decks of these rigs. and asking them, one, telling them that they're not available, but two, would you guys pay more in the event that we could get this technology? And they said, no, you would still have to be competitive with the old technology, but it is the right thing to do. And I informed them, I said it'd be 4 to 5 times more expensive. And they said, no, it's still, the awards are still going to be based on price, but it's the right thing to do. They move into our social criteria, Michael, and they ask us, what are you doing in terms of your giving and what organizations do you give to? And I said, our whole philosophy as a privately held firm is to do the best job we can, meet our clients' requirements, and hopefully have a profit at the end of the year. And then if we give our bonuses and distributions to our owners and employees, I'm not going to tell them where to invest their energy or their dollars. That is their choice. And by having the right team members, they can do with what they want. So for you to tell us and ask us what we should be doing on a social criteria, it goes against what we do as a company. And then finally, again, as a privately held firm, this firm asks us, hey, what is your company's leadership? What is the leadership of your company and how is it made up? And again, I said, how is this relevant to our ESG score? And they said, well, this deals with the governance. And at that moment, I said, being in business for 27 years, I have 7 members on my leadership team. And I think that I can choose the team that is diverse and is equipped to allow us to win the Super Bowl.
Mhm.
And they were very adamant on certain criteria for all of those things, the environmental, social, and governance. And so if you don't think it's happening today, it's just like the Chinese credit system. These companies are forcing smaller firms that aren't publicly traded. And at the end of this whole entire conversation, Michael, I said, hey, why are you guys doing this? And their response was, we have to enforce this on our subcontractors so we can have the ESG score we need as a publicly traded firm.
Well, when I hear you say that, a few things come to mind. The first one is it seems like this is a concerted effort to deindustrialize the West. Seems like somebody, group of people, have a calculated plan to destroy the infrastructure that underpins American society, although it's not just happening in America. But everything you're talking about has to do with food production, it has to do with energy independence, really our entire way of life. So that's the first part of what I think when I hear you say that, and like your opinion too on that. But the second thing I think is really important too, the point that you mentioned that they want to mandate doing the right thing. And that's where I think this gets really slippery. So if you think about this for just a moment, what they're saying is the people that control the ESG scores is they know what the right thing to do is. And what we often talk about when David and I give this presentation about ESG is where it comes from. Where does ESG come from? Well, a big part of it is that in 2019, a group of very successful individuals, the CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the world, got together at the Business Roundtable in 2019, and they decided that they're going to redefine capitalism. So before this, we had shareholder capitalism, which was businesses are in the business of making money. And then suddenly they went to the stakeholder capitalism model, where businesses are not just in the business of making money, but they're doing good in the world. But what I would wonder though is who decides what is doing right in the world, right? So what may be considered the appropriate thing to do when it comes to the environment or the makeup of your board or the social causes that you're doing, nobody can tell you that this is definitively right because we have subjective views on what is good and bad, whereas we don't have subjective views on making money. It seems to me the real problem is that someone gets to determine what is right, and then they get to tell your business what to do. Would that be accurate?
That's exactly accurate, Michael. I mean, when we look at this and what we're seeing in in the hydrocarbon space, specifically the Permian Basin in Midland, um, I have a friend, very successful, third generation oil and gas family operated business, and so they went and started getting funding from private equity sources. these private equity sources were gung ho to be in the hydrocarbon space, to drill in the Permian Basin, the largest producer of energy independence, a zone with the largest amount of hydrocarbons in the rock, oil and gas, and they were more than happy to be in this business. When their ESG scores, again, another private equity firm, their ESG scores were looked at, and they realized, the company that was loaning them money, that they were in the hydrocarbon space. They said, "Man, you guys can't be in this." The private equity firm calls the third generation family owner of this oil and gas company in Midland, and they say, "Man, don't spend another dime on hydrocarbons." And the owner of this company says, what's going on? We've been producing, we've been meeting all of our metrics, we've been meeting all of our financial goals. And that company simply responded to him, "We can't spend another dime on environmental or on ESG activities which are not going to align with climate change and making the world a better place." And in their opinion, making the world a better place. And so when these companies and private equity firms and large scale companies decide that they're not going to fund and provide capital to smaller firms, that's how they're enforcing these actions on all of us.
Well, at the end of the day, it sounds a lot like empty virtue signaling. I think it's really easy if you're abundant and life is going your way to suddenly take up these pet causes and say, well, it's evil what America is doing to the environment. It's evil what these corporations are doing. And so we've got to stop them. We've got to prevent people from having regular cars. They have to have electric vehicles. We have to stop using so much nitrogen and the fertilizer that is sustaining our food. But what I think the problem is, it's very easy to say this stuff to virtue signal, but they don't realize that the way it's going to affect them and their families and other people's families. Like I think about this, for instance, you know, however you feel about climate change, we have John Kerry, the so-called climate czar, flying off to the COP20 event or whatever it is, and he's in a private jet, and he's lecturing us about the cars that we use and our lawnmowers and things like this. But John Kerry lives in a vastly different world from most Americans. Many Americans in this country, it's been reported, can't even fund a $600 emergency, much less get on a private plane. And so it seems like the real losers in all of this will be those people. It will not be the John Kerrys of the world. Do you feel the same way? What are your thoughts about that?
I think so, 100%. And you brought up two really poignant points there, Michael. When you look at the haves and the have-nots, you look at the ultra wealthy versus the middle class, and then the lower middle class, and then of course the lower class. If an individual can retire in America with $10,000 to $15,000 in their retirement fund, they're doing well. That's an hour's worth of jet fuel burn on a Gulfstream or a jet, in 1 hour's burn, not counting the pilot's time or just the rental of the aircraft. As these folks make these changes and they continue to limit the options and they force society to move in this direction, by all measures, it's a horrible infraction on their personal liberties. So how do folks deal with this? One, they don't even know about it, and it's being pushed on it. And climate change, the history of the world is there a climate an issue going on right now? Is there a meteorological change going on? There might be, but is it as a result of hydrocarbons? It is not a result of hydrocarbons. And that's not what this book really talks about. We've had meteorological anomalies and fluctuations as long as there's been a fossil record in geologic time scale. I mean, if you go back just 600 years ago into the desert Southwest between Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, there were huge thriving populations. The Anasazi, the ancestral Puebloan Indians, and they all, because of a huge drought, had to migrate out, and there was a large scale disruption and migration of humanity in that period. And there's been multiple examples in all civilizations across the world that have had climate impact that have caused changes in their society. So to go back to the original question with John Kerry and how that is impacting, the lower class Americans and lower class individuals throughout the world. The haves will continue to have, the have-nots are just going to continue to have more and more restrictions placed on their lives and ultimately what their retirement looks like.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to these issues, however you feel about climate change, one thing that's never floated, I never hear about it, is just the simple act of planting trees. Why can't we just
Yeah,
plant more trees, right? Why do we
plant more
have to
trees.
restrict people's movements? I think that there's been a new law in terms of what kind of wood burning stove you can own in places like California. They won't let you have a combustible engine when it comes to mowing your lawn, but meanwhile, John Kerry can fly on these planes and do whatever they like. But when I think about this stuff too, I remember a conversation that you and I had. We were in Amarillo when you were speaking about a private plane. I think you told me that a friend of yours was trying to get financing to buy a private plane, and he had the right credentials. He would have qualified for the loan, but he couldn't access it because they were saying he was exceeding his carbon allotment or something crazy like that. Does that ring a bell?
That's true. Yeah, a very good friend of mine has a very large nationwide uh, trucking business, and so his has a connection, and they actually do sell very nice private aircraft jets, and they had a client that wanted to buy a jet, and the bank would not loan them the money because they already had too much carbon emissions. Their carbon footprint was too high, and the bank wouldn't loan, even though they met all the metrics and had all of the right uh, financial strength to buy this jet. The bank wouldn't help them with the majority of the loan, so it made a better financial decision for them because their carbon footprint was already too large. And so that's a crazy example of folks that have more than enough, but the banks are being hampered by those that are funding the large nationwide banks or really large financial institutions. When you get the large companies that support them or are sponsoring loans with them, um, it's amazing that is occurring.
Well, it reminds me of what I hear about 15-minute cities. So for anyone that doesn't know what a 15-minute city is, the idea is that because of the boogeyman, climate change, we need to restrict the transportation, the movements of people within a certain area. So on the one hand, it sounds good because under this model, you would be presumably within 15 minutes a drive of whatever you would need from a hospital to places to buy your groceries, your church, whatever it is that you need. But then that would be the carrot approach. But the stick approach is what I experienced living in London. Now, this was back in 2000 and 2001. Actually, yeah, and then when I visited in 2004, I saw this. So they have I think they still have it, and I think it's much higher. They have a congestion tax. For anyone that's driving in the central part of London, you have to pay, I think at the time, I think it was 15 quid just to take your car out there. Now, we haven't had something like this go on in America, at least not yet. But when you talk about your buddy that couldn't get access to financing for the private plane, this is what it reminds me of where we're going. It's the way that these people, these NGOs, these various organizations like BlackRock and the government structures behind them, the way they work is they slow roll these ideas out. So it's not like they hit you with this right away, but they begin to slowly introduce things like what happened to your friend, and then it normalizes it. So before long, we begin to see it on our bank applications just for regular everyday people. You can't get access to whatever it is you're looking for because you're exceeding your carbon allotment. And then little by little, we're now stuck in this dragnet around ESG. That's the way it feels to me, at least. How about you?
Hey, what's amazing is when you say that in terms of a congestion tax. If you look right now and as of today and I saw it this morning when I was getting ready reading the news, Reuters did I say that correct?
I think Yeah, I think that's correct. Or
Yeah,
Reuters, I think.
Reuters. Yeah, they had an article this morning, and I just looked it up, and it said New York City's Metropolitan Transportation Authority voted on Monday to implement a $9 congestion mitigation charge for driving in Manhattan starting on January 5th.
There you go.
This is aimed at raising billions for mass transit and cutting traffic going in and out of Manhattan. So we see that happening right now, and you experienced that in London. You when was that? 10 years ago. So we see that coming into Manhattan on January 5th. Now going back into those 15-minute cities, you really brought something to light to me, and that was the regional flights. And I think it was in France that when we
Mhm.
were having this conversation,
Yeah.
that anything that was an hour or less in airtime, which would be 5 hours or less in travel time, would be restricted to cut the inner city commuting aircraft to the hubs. And so that would affect me greatly living in Amarillo. And so we have four nonstop flights a day on Southwest, four on American, and there's a couple of United flights to Denver and Houston, but it's 350 miles from Amarillo, which is a regional hub for the western part of the state of Texas, and we have 8 flights a day that are going into either Dallas Fort Worth or Dallas Love Field. And so if that were to pass here, each one of those planes is anywhere from 100 to 140 humans that are traveling as passengers, souls on board. And if they restricted those flights in the name of climate change to limit those regional carriers or those regional routes, uh, imagine that would add at least 1,200 probably vehicles a day traveling to Dallas. Because if you have 140 folks on one Southwest flight, I mean, maybe it's 70 cars if a couple was on that. 70 times 2 is 140. I mean, imagine how much more pollution and time and inefficiency would be realized as we had to travel from Amarillo just to get to Dallas to connect with another flight going to another city, or if Dallas is the end result. And it just doesn't make any sense at all for the congestion and the additional burn. But that's exactly what you're talking about on these 15-minute cities. And with congestion taxes, I mean, they're just forcing us to go to a route. And really, is the problem climate change, or is the problem too many humans at 8.8 billion and growing? Because if we have a congestion tax, the very thing that ESG is trying to stop doesn't even address what could be the root of the problem.
Well, that's certainly true. When I hear you say that, I'm reminded of a chapter that we have in the book called The Fishbowl. And the idea is that the people behind ESG are only selectively enforcing it. So they're pushing it on places like America and Canada. Meanwhile, other developing countries like China and India are not being held to the same requirements. And so if we even believe for a moment this idea that coal and the like and the hydrocarbons are producing the man-made climate change that's warming up the earth and causing all these problems, if we do believe that for one moment, does it make any sense that we only selectively apply it in America? We take America back in an industrial fashion, and meanwhile, the rest of the world is affected in this collective fishbowl because they are allowed to produce that energy with no one stopping them. I think it shows just how hollow this whole thing is. If it was really an existential problem, would we really have John Kerry flying around the world, right? Would we really have the Obamas living on the edge of the ocean line, that their home might sink into the water if they're worried about climate change? And would it really make sense that we're allowing China to continue to create all of this so-called this climate producing pollution? Would it really make sense? It seems like
No,
I don't think they
it
believe any of that stuff themselves.
no. So I mean, let's look at that. Why do we have such strict environmental laws in the United States? It's by the very bounty. It's by the very industries. It's by the dense energy sources of hydrocarbons that produce all of the industry and the great wealth that this country has produced, the United States. So when we have great output, great industry, and a large GDP and a large tax base in each state, then we can fund the cleanest water. We can fund the cleanest air. We can fund all the remedial activities that we have that keep our environment as pristine as possible. So if we can't get a coal-fired power plant permitted in the United States, or we're in an initiative to get rid of all the coal-fired power plants, but every week China brings on two different units that have the capacity of 250 kilowatts of power, coal-fired power every week. What is that doing? And just like you said with the fishbowl, if you and I are swimming in a swimming pool, and I decide to go to the bathroom in the pool, number one, and we're both swimming in the water that has the urine in it. So with that being said, that's exactly what's going on here. There's no rules against them pumping out all this coal and all these emissions. And where does the jet stream go? From China, it goes right to the west coast of the United States or up into Alaska, depending on the jet stream. And so what they're doing is basically contaminating the fishbowl, the swimming pool, so to speak. And there's nobody's talking about that. They're only on us and on the United States. And so when we stop the energy production in these power plants, well, then we don't have enough power to run the AI, the machines that are doing AI. We're already at a deficit right now in the United States on our power grid on so many different levels. But yet in China, they're just creating as many coal-fired power plants as they want. They're going to have an excess of 1 million gigawatts. And from a defense standpoint, that is scary. But we have unlimited coal, but everybody's moving away from coal. We have unlimited natural gas, and they want to cap our natural gas resources. They want to cap hydrocarbons. And why? Because we're going to make the planet cleaner? No, they're just creating these plants not only in China, but in India, in Brazil, and all of our enemies that have no desire to do the right thing environmentally, but yet on the other side, they don't spend any money on environmental regulation and environmental cleanup. So ESG, when we say environmental, it is actually harming the very thing it professes to protect.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think also I would add to that, really what they're doing is they're picking winners and losers. They're picking which countries can thrive and which countries cannot. Um, we just recently had the election, and we had a sea change in who, in terms of which political party is in power. I talked to somebody recently who felt like that was a really good thing for the demise of the ESG movement. Now, on the one hand, I think that is true because even though we're dealing with very moneyed interests like BlackRock and Vanguard that are behind this, at the same time, it seems like the public will has left. It seems that we've surpassed peak wokeism, where people are buying into these destructive ideas that are undermining society. But on the other hand, it feels like the people that are behind this won't give up very easily. They want power at all costs. When you think about what happened with the election and the way society is moving right now, are you encouraged?
In terms of getting rid of ESG or at least making it a level playing field, absolutely, I'm encouraged. I do not believe for a second that the administration that is coming in is going to tolerate this. They're going to be America first. They're going to move forward with producing as much hydrocarbons and natural energy as we can to recreate an industrial complex, to take it out of the hands of our enemies and make America strong. But going back, when was it that Schwab originally wrote his
2020.
uh, the Klaus Schwab and the recapitalization? When was that written,
He wrote The
Michael?
Great Reset in 2020. Apparently, it was supposed to be in June 2020, which miraculously somehow we got the book out there in what, 3 months after the world shut down. But that's when that book came out in 2020.
So he wrote that book, or he wrote the material, um, and now we're in 2024. So by having the administration that we're going to have, it's going to help curtail that. But these forces and these folks, they're not going to be swayed by a 4-year presidency. I mean, when we look at countries, and you would know this from being in China. They work on a 50-year plan. Their goals are 50 years long. The United States, we vacillate every 4 to 8 years, depending on the administration. And it's just this giant seesaw motion and the flavor of the week. Thank God we have some unity in both, the House, the Senate, the judiciary, and with the executive branch. Um, but they could curtail it back, but those forces are still at work. And what's most amazing is, again, 98% of the folks in the world do not understand what ESG is. Now, ESG might not be front and center in the United States, but it will be front and center in Western Europe. It's going to be front and center in lots of different countries that are developing, but it won't be front and center in China. It won't be front and center in India. Very unlikely that it'll have any implication in the Middle East or in Africa or South America. So we're really only talking about westernized nations that are going to feel the brunt of this. Hopefully, with the new administration, though, we're going to be able to see some relief for our industries and maybe just a formal repeal of it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting what you say there in terms of other nations like China thinking in such long-term goals. I think that is something that America needs to get better at. There's a book called Socialists Don't Sleep, and it's about what you're talking about, where they are unceasing in their efforts to get what they want, and they don't think about things like term limits and 4 years or 8 years or whatever it is. It's my opinion that if you want to combat what is really at the heart of ESG, which I think is it's a sickness in the soul. Um, I think it comes from a lack of faith in something higher than oneself. And so if you don't have a God, if you don't have something that is bigger than you, that you can put your energy and your devotion and your time into, then you begin to fall for these pseudo causes like ESG. And I think that's really what is going on right now. And I think it doesn't necessarily begin in our college classrooms. I think it begins as early as preschool, in which different forces are shaping our children's minds to believe in these kind of things, to believe in this phony secular humanism. And then as a child gets older and they go through college and they go through all these indoctrination systems, they begin to want to push these ideas, not knowing that they actually work against their own interest. And when I hear you say that in America we don't think long term, it seems to me that what's necessary is that we begin to plant the seeds for these ideas so that parents tell it to their children and their children tell it to their children. And you set up ways in which we are continually telling these type of stories, because this is not the first time this type of seizure of power has happened. It's happened throughout history. It goes on in cycles, and we need to be guarding against it. And that's why tradition and remembering your roots and what got you to this point is so important, to encourage, especially men, to want to lead their families, to want to be courageous, and to want to provide for their families instead of abdicating their role and just allowing the government to fix all the problems for them. I feel like in order to turn things around, we need to have a different story that we tell about our nation that trickles down to all the people so that we will not fall for this kind of stuff next time.
That's, as you and I have written this book, and the reason we came together. And for those of you that don't know, Michael and I, we met through a mutual friend, and we worked together on this book for 26 months before we actually even saw each other, face to face. And it was a calling for both Michael and I. And it was a calling because it's not right what ESG mandates are doing on so many levels. And we Michael and I both challenge you to read the book and go through the 13 chapters, and we have an incredible forward. But as Michael and I were drawn to write this from a higher calling and just a divine spiritual nature, it really became evident that as fathers of sons and individuals that truly care about what's going on in the United States, that this tale had to be told. This story needed to be expressed. When we look at the mass hysteria that is surrounding, climate change is the greatest natural disaster. Is it, or is it not? That's not the impetus of this book. What we're talking about on this book is, others making choices through mass hysteria, others making choices for you and I's family and everyone that's listening to this is family, our businesses, the communities we call home, forcing us to have folks that might not align with our beliefs on the leadership groups and the governance of our companies, governance of entities that we value. And again, I subscribe to the notion that we all are strong enough to pick the greatest members, the teams that will get us to the Super Bowl, the teams that will get the results that we want, Michael. And we don't need the government. When has the government been involved in anything that has borne fruit in communities of faith and communities of energy, communities of opportunity and hope? And we don't see that. And so finally, the last piece of what you're talking about, Michael, is how do we have a conversation? How do we uh, write a book that such as Creative Destruction, where it just has some narrative, that it's not a right, it's not a left book, but it's actually what is going on that is detrimental to us achieving success as a nation, as families, as men, as women, and what is gonna set that standard. Like we said earlier, if China is working on a 50-year plan, can you imagine? Let's just think for a minute, Michael. If you and I lived in a world where it was a 10-year term for a governing body to make the greatest change, do you think they would keep kicking the can down the road and adding $5 trillion to the debt, $5 trillion to the debt, to where we are now? What is it, 32 trillion? Is that what we have right now? It's just some ungodly number with so many zeros, it doesn't even make sense. And I think when we have 4-year turns, they just kick it down the road because it's not going to really be their problem.
Yeah.
But if it was somebody that had a 10-year deal or a 20-year deal, and granted, China is broke right now and their population densities are going to crumble. But if you had a longer term, more accountability based leader instead of kicking it down the road every 4 years, do you think it would be different? I
I,
do. I think it'd be hugely different. And I think parties would take a harder look at, hey, we've got to get this under control. But if I just survive for 4 to 8 years, then it's going to be SEP, somebody else's problem.
yeah, I mean, we don't want a system where Xi Jinping is the leader for life, of course, but I get what you're saying
Yeah,
because
yeah.
only thinking about the short-term horizon, I mean, I would argue that we're only thinking in 2-year spurts or less. Because if you think about the last presidential election, I mean, Trump was already campaigning 2 years into Biden's presidency, maybe even earlier. Unofficially, he was already running for office. And then that becomes this big spectacle that we're looking at. And I think what that spectacle does is that it takes away our power. Instead of us doing something for our country, getting involved, we're just thinking about who's going to win the presidential election because it's this big contest we're all watching, just like a boxing match that we're not participating in.
WWF, who's going to win, right?
Right.
And just who outspends.
Right, but in terms of long-term solutions, I do want to come back to something that you mentioned before. Unfortunately, um, the people that benefit from it have turned this into a right or left issue. If you
Mhm.
care about ESG, you're presumably a Republican, and the opposite, right, is true as
Right.
well. But what we really try to do with this book is to demonstrate that despite what they'll tell you, this is not at all a political issue. If you go to the grocery store and the prices are 70% higher, or there isn't even food on the shelves because it was never created in the first place, it ceases to be a political question. It's a survival question. And the same thing is true when it comes to the fishbowl that we've talked about that we live in. This is not a right or left issue. We all live on this planet, and it should be something that we all care about. Really, David and I tried so hard when we were writing this book to show people that it is a people issue, that we should be caring about this. It doesn't matter your political affiliation, it will affect you and your children.
You know what? Let's just talk about that for a minute. When we go to the grocery store, we have just an abundance of choices and flavors of cereals and grains. And I mean, we go to the large grocery stores and it's unbelievable. Most people don't realize that you only have 3 days worth of food in most grocery stores of the staple items. And if the supply chain were not to deliver those products, about 3 to 5 days, and that huge bounty is going to be used up. Let's take an even deeper dive. If we go back to ESG and what ESG is trying to do, and that's get rid of hydrocarbons. Do you realize, and I know you do, Michael, but do the folks listening and watching this, do they realize that without natural gas, we can't make fertilizer? And without fertilizer for our crops, we would have a 60 to 80% reduction in crop yield. So just go to the grocery store right now. If ESG were able to completely eliminate fossil fuels, just take 60, we'll split the difference. Let's take 75% of the grain products on the cereal row, take 75% of those products off the shelf, and what you're left with is what we would be able to produce if we didn't have fertilizer in this country. And if that doesn't scare you to death right now, just thinking about that and all the initiatives that folks are trying to do, if we don't have natural gas, and natural gas is a byproduct of drilling for oil. If we don't have the funding from private equity or from banks or lending institutions because ESG scores and the SEC are not allowing that activity to occur, then we don't have the natural gas being created. Without natural gas, we can't create fertilizer. Without fertilizer, we can't create food. That's just one example that we talk about in this book. And without food, that's the basic level of Maslow's hierarchy of food, shelter, water, the basic necessities that a society or a human needs to survive. And we're trying to destroy the very basic fabrics of things that we have taken for granted in this country to create so much. And it's just appalling that most folks don't even realize that you only have 3 days worth of food. They don't realize where the supply chain comes from. It's a gross miseducation of really what makes this country work.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the Maslow's pyramid because I think this speaks to the sickness that I was talking about earlier. The ability for abundant Americans to even suggest that we would get rid of fertilizer in the way that you're talking about, to even suggest that we would stop drilling, that we would stop doing all of these things that provide America its abundance, comes from the fact that we have abundance. We have materially satiated all those needs to the point where people have little else to do with their time but to imagine new problems. You know why? Because they're not hungry, right? And their kids aren't going hungry. And so they're coming up with problems that don't exist to fill that emptiness in their lives. However, it's our hope that with a book like this, that people wake up to that and they see past all of the lies that they've been told, and also
Mhm.
just being informed about ESG because David's right. Most people don't even know what ESG is and why it matters so much. Before we close today, David, do you want to leave any final thoughts and then also tell people where they can pick up the book?
Michael, again, just a final thought. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you on this project, and I challenge anyone that is looking for someone to work on a project with them in terms of writing or writing a book or just creative thoughts. Give Michael a call. He's absolutely fantastic, and he took the ramblings of a environmental scientist and helped create a manuscript and a narrative that is really hopefully going to move the needle, much like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring or Upton Sinclair The Jungle or any other book. You know, the what is it? The pen is mightier than the sword, and if we can have a conversation and this book starts that conversation and we can turn the narrative with our children. And we hadn't even talked about the education system and how our children are being indoctrinated right now. If we can have an honest conversation about what hydrocarbons are doing, what the needs are in terms of moving supply chain, what this is doing to our society, it's going to make a huge difference. And I think that is where I would like to just finish up is this book again was written. Let it start a conversation, not just with your coworkers, but have a conversation with your kids, have a conversation with your grandchildren, have a conversation with your wife. This book is not written in a scientific technical format. It's written for everyone to understand, and it is clearly a challenging read, but it's going to open up your eyes individually, in your family and in your community what's really happening. How can you get the book? You can get it on Amazon. You can get a Kindle version, or you can get a hard copy. And just if you type in Creative Destruction ESG, you're going to find a ton of hits. And then we also have a web page, Michael and I do, creativedestructionbook.com. And of course, if you buy it, please leave us a review. And we look forward to just sharing the journey with everyone. And Michael, as always, it's just awesome to talk with you. I said earlier, 26 months and hundreds of hours of conversation like this have created something I think that we both can be very proud of.
Well, you're very kind, David. I appreciate that. And for my part, I just want to say it's been a true honor working with you as well, and that I learned so much from you because this is really your specialty. So again, please check out the book if you get a chance. It's been an honor working with you, David, and talking about this really important subject. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Michael.